Hello, everyone. Welcome to the virtual video we have today for week 6 in our web design course. Today, we're going to continue our discussion on HTML and begin our talks on how to take your HTML document that we have created this week and how we style the HTML document to have it look, the way we want it to look. So last week we had discussed the different aspects of HTML. It's pretty much the structure of your document consists of HTML tags, such as meta tags, which are used to bring in either external resources such as scripts, style sheets, links to other pages. It's also used for giving keywords to give a title to your document that would be used in the GUI of the web browser operating system. Sometimes it's used in the tab. The title is different from the actual the H1, H2 tags, which are essentially structural tags, which is the next tag that you see on the list here. And then you have, so structural tags, you have things such as the paragraph, div, span. You also have tables, ordered lists, unordered lists, so on. Then you also have presentation tags, which are things such as the strong tag, the emphasis tag, which just it'll essentially bold the text that you have within the tag. If you're using strong, emphasis will essentially italicize it. And then with those tags have attributes. Attributes are essentially properties you can give to your HTML elements. For example, the input element, you can define a type. So by default, if you don't define a type attribute for your input element, you'll have a text box. But if, say, you set the type attribute equal to checkbox, it will change your text box input tag into a little checkbox that you can click on and check and uncheck. Tags can also be nested, so you can have, say, an ordered list tag contained within a div tag that's contained within the body tag, which is then contained within the HTML tag. And then we also discussed the class attribute, which we'll be talking more about today. The class attribute is really used for setting your tag elements to give them a styling. Either use the class attribute to give styling, which is then linked with a cascading style sheet, which is what we're going to get into in a second, or you use the actual style attribute and embed the style, your descriptors, right into the HTML tag, which is a big no-no, but it is an option that you can do, but it's not best practice. And then you also have the ID attribute, which is it's used to uniquely identify elements within your HTML document for later use, such as utilizing it in a JavaScript routine, or to even have maybe one special element that you want to give special styling to. You can use the ID attribute, which we're actually going to go over today. So what are cascading style sheets? So cascading style sheets, while the HTML is the content of our document, cascading style sheets is how we define the style of the document. So you can think of it, the best way I think of it, as themes. If you want to have, say, your website have different themes, you can define different style sheets for those themes. So for example, let's say you had a dark theme, and a light theme. You can use have two different style sheets that have different definitions, and interchange them in and out to show the style of the page. So as we said, yeah, HTML dictates the content of the document. So you can have multiple CSS files, as I was just talking about, applied to the document, hence the name cascading. These are normally defined. There's two ways you can define styles. So you can define them in the link tag, which is in the meta section, which we had talked about last week. So you can have multiple link tags for that would bring in the style sheets and apply them to your HTML document. Or you can also embed what's called you can use the style tag in an HTML document, just like you can use a script tag to define JavaScript. You can create a style tag to embed inline styles. That's called inline, when you actually place the style or your JavaScript, let's say, within the HTML document. That's inline versus external. So you can also do that. You can use a style tag to define your cascading style sheet rules. And which gets to my next point. So CSS is actually a collection of rules. So you'll have what's called a selector, and the selector essentially it gives a description of the types of elements that you want to select, and then if that selector meets certain conditions, then the style that's defined for the selector is applied to the element, which is what we'll get into next. So here's the CSS syntax. If you look here up above, you have the selector, right? So in this case, the selector is going to be the H1 tag. You have then your declaration, which is a set of property and values. So in this case, we're saying property color, which is going to be the color of the text. We're going to set to blue. And then also, we're going to say the font size, we're going to set to 12 pixels. And so anyway, let's start from the beginning there, the selector, which is this here. So the selector is used to find or select the HTML elements in the document based on either element name, which in this case, for our selector, we're using an element name, which is all H1 tags. Could be an ID, which is the ID attribute that we had talked about last class. You would start, if you were selecting based on ID, you would start it with a hash symbol and then the ID name. Class, which is the class attribute that we were talking about before, and or a combination of all three of these. Or, I'm sorry, also attribute is a selector you can do too. So you can actually say all tags with this attribute apply this style, which isn't really used too often, but actually, no, it actually is. Attribute, for you to apply the attribute, it would be, you would have square braces and then the attribute name, and then you can also say even the value of what the attribute is going to be set to there. I don't think I have it in these slides here, but I'm going to add it on after this video and when I apply it up on Canvas. But anyway, yes, so let's go into the selector again. So we have element ID, we have element ID and class. You can also group selectors together. So for example, right now we just have the H1 selector applied to, that's going to apply this style here. We could have said H1, comma, H2, comma, P, which means essentially just apply this style here to all tags that have H1, that are either H1 or H2 or P tags. Then the declaration. So the declaration here uh, can contain more than one declaration. They're separated by a semicolon. So in this case, we have two declarations here for setting the color and the font size. Each declaration includes a CSS property, name, and value separated by a colon. So that's the format here. You have property. So I mean, there's millions of properties out there. So you'd have common ones are like color, font, text. You can also have like margin, padding, etc., which we'll get into later. We'll actually go over the common ones today. But yeah, so you have the property, the value that you set, and then separated by a by a colon. Declarations always end with a semicolon, and this is called the declaration block here. And they always start with a open curly brace, close curly brace. So this is just one rule here that we've defined up top. So in the next slide here, let's go over these selectors. Later on, I'll show you how you can have multiple rules defined. So this basic selectors that we have, again, first thing you want to obviously do in all these cases is select your HTML element. So the element selector selects based on the tag name. So for example, specifying P as a selector will select all P tags on the page. If you said div, it would select all div tags. If you said P comma div, it would select all P comma div tags. You also have ID. ID is the whatever the tag, whatever tags have the ID attribute set to the element. So usually it starts off with the hash symbol, hash character, and then followed by the ID name. And then class selects based on the class attribute that was set for the element. Another thing I want to point out too for HTML that for the class attribute, you can actually define, you can actually set HTML elements to multiple classes, which I'll show you when I do the actual demoing. But yeah, so the class attribute is another important selector that's used. So you always start that off with a period. So usually a lot of times, a lot of style sheets that you'll probably see, you'll see a lot of names usually with a dot at the beginning. So it'd be like dot blog post, let's say, or dot, let's say dot picture. Those are many times when you have these style sheets, most of the rules that are set are for set for classes, because then it makes it easy for the web designer to just go and swap in and out the class names to elements. And then in addition to this, classes also have a form of inheritance that goes with this. So you can actually, when you define say some classes in your CSS by doing the dot, class name, your HTML element, you can actually have it be assigned to two classes, and it'll actually absorb essentially or inherit. It'll inherit both class properties into the element and apply that styling. And this is what it kind of looks like here. So on the left here, you can see all of these are essentially element selectors, you have the body, and this is another thing to point out too is which I think in the next slide I go over is you have so what can happen here. Notice how I have body is set to the color red, and then P tag is set to green, and then H1, H2, div set to orange. So what that essentially does, if you think about this too, so any tags within this body element, so you're going to have, let's say, list. You can have list tags like ordered or unordered list. You can have div tags, span tags, tables, etc. Um, all the text, if there's no other definitions that meet the rules of specificity, which we'll get into next. Whichever one of these is more best way to describe how this kind of works here when you get into how these get inherited is whichever one is more descriptive will win. So, for example, here, um, if we had, say, a body tag with p tags in it, right? Because we have a declaration here for a specific declaration for p tags to be the color green, this will be applied versus this red color here, if that makes any sense. And then, as always, please message me on Slack or email me if you have any questions on stuff like this, because as we get further on in the class, there's going to be little nuances that probably we'll have questions about. But in this case here, but I'll dive more into this, I think, in the next slide. But just keep in mind when you're setting these rules. It's not necessary. Sometimes you have to be wary of the rule that you set. So, like, if you wanted, let's say, all of your text to be red on a page, and then later on you have, say, these rules here, you have to be wary that these rules may beat out this rule here, which we'll get into, like I said, when we talk about specificity. So anyway, yeah, these are all element selectors here. This one's using a grouping, so this one's H1 or H2 or div. And then on this side here, this is a ID selector. So this usually is only going to be applied to one element. So in this case, blog post 1 will have purple text assigned to it. And then here we have a class selector. So blue element will be set to the blue text. And then here is actually an example of using both a name selector and a class selector together. So in this case, all span tags that have the blue element class assigned to it will receive this color. And this color format here, the hash 44DDFC, that actually is a format to define color using hexadecimal notation. It gives you a more precise red, green, blue color selection here. You can also define alpha, I believe. I think you can actually go one further. I think alpha would be the transparency. So in this case here, yeah, for all those comp sci people here, the first First 3 bytes are going to be, in this case, the red, green, blue channel, and then the last byte, which we don't have defined, is going to be the alpha, which is the transparency of the element. Um, you don't have to know that, but it's just in case you had any questions, you can yeah, you can look further into it on there. So anyway, CSS classes used extensively for styling. It's denoted by a leading period. And like I was just talking about before, so styles have different rules for winning out, or when two style rules conflict, which one gets applied. This is what's called specificity, and it's actually based on a like a point system, believe it or not. So, like if we go back to here, uh, looking back at it here, um, as you go down through the uh, through the list here, this one is probably the most you know most specific on the type of elements it wants to apply. So if you were to, like, say for example, have a say another span element, uh, say you said all spans were going to be color red, right? Um, this one is going to beat out, say, the other span element, um, or even the blue. This blue element here. It's going because of it's defining. There's um, two selectors, two selector rules being applied. So it has a higher value when evaluating which rule to apply for these CSS classes. And I have so the basic rule of thumb is whichever selector describes the element in more detail wins. So, and then also the ID selector, so back here again, this ID selector is going to pretty much beat out uh, all these other ones when it comes time to select uh, the element or apply the style rules, because it's a unique value. Only one ID element should be applied on the page, so it usually wins out in terms of specificity. And then there's more detail you can read about it on Mozilla Developer Network. There's the link for the article there. It's pretty detailed, but something to check out uh, if it's something you're interested in. So let's get into our first example here. So this example here is a pen I had made for the blog post. So you can see here I have some classes defined. So I have the blog post, blog title, classes. They're all applied to these. You have div and h1 elements here that have this class set to it. So if I wanted to example for all blog posts that have the um, so for here I have green set to all paragraphs. So you can see here all these paragraph tags have the have the have the green color set to it, and if I wanted to, let's say, change this to let's say do it up here actually, just to show you what's going to happen here. So let's say instead of, we change it to orange, right? So in this case, specificity, the element tag beat out the um, this class tag here. But what we could do is actually look. There's a blog post P. So if I go, oops. Which isn't defined, I see. So what we could do is just say, create a new one, dot blog dash post dash P, color orange, and then that applied the orange to all class elements that have. So if we were to say take this out here, right, took that class out, and then look, it changed it to the green green tag there. And then what you could also do is, in addition to that, you could say, so let's say we change this to, change this back here. So if we were to change this to say a div, right? So now this is a div. Whoops. Go back to here. Still have everything. If we were to just go and put that P in front of it here, you can see what happens. So it's going to apply all P tags that have the blog post P class with the orange color, or in this case here, yeah, we don't, since it doesn't meet that criteria, it's not going to apply the rule. Also doesn't meet the paragraph criteria, so it doesn't apply the green element. And then this here, so what's happening also is we also have things like border. So the way we're getting these borders right now around the HTML elements is via these attributes right here. You have border, margin bottom, which is what's giving us this little space at the bottom here, and then padding, which gives us padding around the. So if I were to, just going to show you what happens if I were to go and like adjust some of these values here. So for example, like if I wanted that gap to be a little larger, we can change this to say 20 px. That just made it a little wider. Go up to like say 50, and so on. And then the padding, padding's actually applied around the inside perimeter, so it's the content. I'll show you on one of these slides how that works. Margin and padding work, but padding is going to be how much padding is applied to the inside. So if I were to change this value to say 25, you'll see how there's additional white space thrown in around the border of these boxes. So that's what the padding property does for these elements here. And then, like I said, you can see why it's kind of useful to have these types of rules set, because just changing one item here just changed essentially the look of the rest of the page, because anything that has that within that blog post class here has this style inherited throughout because of the class inherit because of the style sheet property inheritance that you get based upon the the selector, the definition here. So let's go on. Let's continue. So some of the properties that we have, the color. text properties. So color is going to change the color of the text, as we saw before on the page. Font weight is really just the how thick the letters are. Essentially, you're setting it from normal to bold. And then there's different levels of bold. I guess best way you can describe it. You can have the font style is the type of typography you have. So it's going to be, say, like a font type like Arial or Times New Roman. You can also set if it's italic, underline, I think bold too, in this type of property. The font size is how big the text is on the page. You also have text alignment, so you can do text align, which is left, right, or center. And you also have text indent, which allows you to indent paragraphs into the document. So there's also measurements you have to be aware of. So CSS has a bunch of measurements for legacy reasons. It goes back to essentially back to the old printing days, because essentially it's a layout type of language. It's to define positioning, and most of the time you're going to use the PX and the EM for positioning. It's usually preferred to use EM because of EM is relative to certain things, and so for PX is pixels. Pixels are not uniform across all browsers. For example, Firefox has a different pixel measurement versus Google Chrome, but it will be uniform on your page. So what that essentially means is if you're defining things in pixels, your positioning on the page is going to be at least it's going to be the same when looking at it via the relative positioning will be uniform in, let's say, if you're looking at Firefox. But if you're comparing Firefox with Google Chrome, it may not be a pixel to pixel perfect match in that case. For that, you'd want to use EM or EMS. It's essentially how wide an M is in the current font. So this is good for relative sizes, and it's good for scaling with a font. But I think for most of the things that we're going to be doing, either or is not going to matter really, either pixels or EMs. So we got boxes here. So the way you define boxes is by, and this is good to think about too, because most elements, when they're laid out on the page, is really a box, whether it be a div, a span, a table, list, what have you. It's usually a box. So you have, with any box, you have a width and a height. You can define a border around the box or the element, and the way you would say that is it would actually be the so when I'm talking about width, height, border, you're allowed to say how high and how wide your element is going to be. So, for example, if we go back to our original example here, if we were to just put in, let's say, width 20, no, let's do, I don't know, 50 px, right? That's going to force the width of all of the elements to be at max 50 pixels wide. So we can also say increase it. So if we go to 500, it looks like that. And we can also set a height. I'm not sure. Usually for the height to work, the height has to be set for parent elements, I believe. But let's just try it here. So if we set the height to 50 px, no, it applies it. So, yes, it applied it to the the didn't actually. So, uh, one thing to keep in mind is for things like this, especially with the height, you're going to have stuff like overflow. I think too we can actually say, so if we say overflow, kind of just going off cuff here. You say like overflow. I think it's overflow y done. No. So anyway, it's actually hidden. So what that does is, so if there's overflow on the y-axis, it's just going to cut off. By default, when you define that height here, so if we do 500, let's say, there's some of that stuff back. By default, when you define height, at least width doesn't usually have this most of the time, but I think it does. Uh, so and that's, you'll see this when we do floats in a minute. But anyway, when you have overflow, so even though you defined your width and height on elements, sometimes the stuff within the element is too large to fit within the defined parameters here. And what will happen is it will do this. It will just um, fly off the page here. So if we put that back, uh, let's do something like if we set it to 150, right? Do 150. You can also just have the overflow section up before on overflow dash y. Dun, dun, dun. You can have it do stuff too, like so like you can look here, so we can say overflow scroll or auto, and if we were to do that in this case here, change it to auto would be sufficient. No. Oh, you see how you get these little scroll bars now. So anyway, that's back to what we were trying to talk about here. So elements are, best way to think of them are essentially boxes, and what I'm going over right now are the box type of properties you can apply to your HTML elements. And the basic one here, width and height, you can set. It's pretty obvious, which allows you to set the physical width and height of the element. And then you have some special properties that let you deal with things that happen, such as the overflow. You have overflow Y and overflow X, actually, which tells the browser what to do when your content within the element is too much to, is going to go past your defined element size. But anyway, back to what we're talking about. So yeah, you can define the element width, the height, the border. So you can give a border around your HTML element. You do like solid black border, dash borders. You can set the color of the borders. You can set the thickness. So the first value there is the thickness in pixels. So it goes the value and then the values measurement, so in this case pixels, and then the type of the type of uh, you know boxes. So in this case, it's a solid line versus a dashed versus a dotted line, and then the color, and then that's going to define your border around the box. You can also set the background color of the element, so you can set the whole background to be whatever color you want. Also set an image to it, but you have to specify either a URL or you can do you can actually embed the image data in HTML5 anyway into a essentially like a URL type of format. So it's like a base64 encoded um, image essentially that you're embedding into the page. But yeah, so you can, but yeah, essentially you're setting a URL to the background. And then this is so if you, from I think 2 weeks ago, if you remember our look at Chrome Developer Tools, so this is um, you can see here this is what you would see if you were to actually scroll to the bottom of the of Chrome Developer Tools. It'll actually, when you select an element and scroll to the bottom on the right hand tab, it'll actually show you the properties. So it'll actually show you on the element they have selected what color it is, how much padding is within it. So when you're looking at this, yeah, you see the width, the height, how much padding you have on, and you can specify too, padding left, padding right, uh, the border that you have, and the thickness of the border, and then the margin, which is just essentially the outside padding of the of the element itself. I think I have, yeah. So here's a couple examples here. So let's click on this one and this one here. So this shows, here's our boxes here. Um, this is the definition I have. So if I were to do, the so here's that style attribute I was talking about before. You can actually do this style, which is horrible practice, and say something like, I don't know, with anyway, yeah, you can apply this style tag here. So in this case, I just set the width to 300 pixels. You can see it. This is the bad practice way of doing it, because then what happens is, if I wanted, let's say, to apply this to multiple elements, it becomes a problem here to apply that width. So, like for example, you can see here, see here is the width, right? So if I go and I set this to 7, right? This style attribute is beating out this CSS definition here, which is why it's usually bad practice to do this. It causes a lot of bugs, because most of the time when you're working with, there'll be probably hundreds of elements on the page, and if you have this one rogue, style in there messing things up, it usually causes problems. But anywho, yeah, that was the style tag, and if we go back to this here, you can see we have border, color, margin, padding. So like, yeah, this here, the way this is being defined with the margin is via, it's doing the shorthand instead of doing the full margin bottom, margin top, margin left, margin right. You can define it this way, and I believe it goes, don't hold me to this, I think it's usually, it starts from, I think it's like top, it's usually top left, bottom right, I believe, or right bottom. I'm not sure. I have to look that one up. But anyway, yeah, that's how these styles get applied here. And you can see here, so like this one's got no class, this one's got one class applied to it. And you can see here, yeah, like this class. And here's the inheritance that's going on here. You have this class and another class. But I can show you, so for like the so you can also see too, usually the first class that gets defined wins out. So in this case here, this class beat out another class because it was defined first. But here's the part where you can go and, let's say, I add an attribute such as, we have padding, right? Well, if I put padding in, let's see, padding dash bottom 200 px, right? So that did nothing. So I was looking at the wrong element. So you can see here, yeah, changing that padding, here we'll go and extend, and it's part of that inheritance. So because I have it defined here, you can see it sets it. Now the other thing to notice too is the fact that, yeah, we have a green and a pink, but then if we look at this here, this dash class dot another dash class defines the background color as blue. This will then go and set the background color to blue just because of the specificity rule that we talked about before. This is more specific than these two here, and it goes back to the fact that this has two classes defined, which is why this rule took effect. But you can see though, if you apply stuff to the the other ones here, like, so if we said, margin dash top is 50 px, right? And then is that, oh, probably already defined, so to say 500. Yeah, there we go. That's the other problem. So I'm using repeated values, 100 px. There we go. So you can see that changed the margins for all of those classes. And then if we then go and apply padding bottom, say 60 px, right? I spell it right, padding. Oh, wait, first of all, yeah, no, that was what I wanted. 600 px. There we go. Probably didn't notice the 10 pixel difference. But you can see it actually will, it will still pull these rules. It's just when it goes to calculate the properties that this guy should be, it's essentially this one's going to beat out these ones here, but it will still pull in ones that aren't like the padding bottom, the margin top, that will get pulled in. And because class is higher weight than an element, it'll actually override too, like margin and padding properties here, if that makes sense to everyone. So that's how the inheritance kind of works with it, the specificity and this boxing stuff here. So yeah, and then the other example I had with blog posts is kind of like a actual there it goes. This is like a real world example here. So we got this blog post, and all the posts have are within essentially this blog post. And then what you can do is like within, so like yeah, we have this blog post class. We define this box around everything, but then we can go and say dot blog dash post dash p, right? And then we can say for all of the set the color to red, and then we can say, for example, like then the title, all the titles for it, which are under blog post title, color blue. There. So there we just changed the title and the actual body of everything from red and blue, and you can see how that kind of works here. So yeah, that's how that stuff works here. And then we have the document flow. So this goes back to the when we were talking about with why we wouldn't want to use tables to format. So CSS has a concept called a float. Floating elements will be placed. We'll place the element next to each other instead of the normal behavior, which is placing things on top of each other. So here we have two elements that are floated, and what happens here is they're actually side by side instead of the normal stacking on top of each other. So what will happen is the web browser will attempt to fit as many elements as it can next to each other until there's no longer any horizontal room to do so. And then when there's no room left, the elements will wrap onto the next line, or essentially stack on top of each other. And here's an example here with the box, simple box example. I believe this is floating. Oh no, this is for, this is just another, okay, so yeah, we do have a float. So we have two elements here that are floating. I'm just going to increase the size here. So you can see that right here we have the two boxes next to each other, and they're just these simple little divs here. I don't know if you can see on the video. So these two boxes here are essentially these two divs defined as these child classes here. And what we can do, so just so it's a little easier, we will set the width and the height a little bigger. And this margin is what's controlling the gap in between. So if we were to increase that, say to 15, we get a little bit of a bigger gap. And then if we were to increase the width to say 1200, right? Notice how now they're stacked because there's not enough space on the page to fit both boxes side by side. So now we'll stack instead. So if I were to lower it to say 600 or 100 even, go 600. So we still get the side by side. This is good for mobile device development because, or for developing web pages that are going to work for both desktop and small form factor devices such as phones or tablets. This will allow you to still keep your desired, format, but in the event that somebody does have, say, something, they're viewing your page on something like a smartphone, it will at least reflow the page so that, instead of the user having to go and scroll horizontally and then try to scroll back down and whatnot, um, it will go and have it so that it's a nice smooth scrolling down the page, like like most people probably would prefer to do, just to go. So that's what floating helps you, allows you to do, is to achieve that effect. And we can see it here for the blog posts. We go to this blog post pen I have here. So in this case, yeah, I have them. So what I'll do actually is I'll just go and actually shrink the page, and then if you notice what happened when I shrunk the page down, forgive the little background there, see how it goes, and once there's not enough space, it then stacks up on top of each other, and that's how you use floating pretty much to do that type of effect. So I have an exercise here for styling a page. I would like you to give this a shot when you have an opportunity. So essentially, what I would want you to do is go to this pen here. You go to this CodePen URL. I have this HTML document defined here. What I want you to do is to have it look like this. Change it from that to this here. Just using CSS style sheet rules. The one thing I do want to point out is you do want to keep this one rule here, this box sizing. It just helps when you go to do the exercise. So I'll throw some hints out here. So what you want to do, obviously, for here is, define in your class probably some sort of border, right? We see here that we have a border that's going on. And one thing I did leave out too is for widths, when you set widths and heights, you can actually define, instead of it being a pixel format, you could define it to be in a percentage as well. So if I go back, let me go back again to the simple box example. So if I go back to this page, I guess. So we go back to the simple box example here, right? And we're actually going to put a bunch of these in. Right? Might be essentially given the answer, but so for the width and the height, it's not going to really work well with the height because the height's pretty much unlimited in terms of, but the width it'll work for. So you can define a percentage. So in this case, let's say we're going to set the height to be, so it's a little easier to see, 50, let's do 150 pixels. And then the width will say to be 25%. And take that PX out. So what that does is it actually sets the width of the page to be 25% of the actual width on the page. So in this case, what we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We were to do. So I kind of pretty much revealed how to get it to do that. So if we were to add that in, think because of the margin, I'm probably, yeah, if I were to take the margin out of that, well, now we can't even differentiate. Put that margin back in, do 1px, 2, 3. We lower this, something to deal with the sizing, 20%, yeah. I think too, because, yeah, I see that this isn't being used for whatever reason. Might be something with the actual CodePen editor. But you see how this essentially goes, right? So this, so for width, you can also do a percentage instead of setting a fixed pixel amount. And like I said, the percentage is the percentage of the width available on the page. So in this case, yeah, if we were to set it to 25%, it should have actually done for four boxes across. I think there's something. It's something probably to do with the editor itself, this CodePen editor. But yeah, you would. You can actually kind of get a. And then what will happen too is when you go to shrink, it'll actually adjust the size of the boxes. You can see here. So that was pretty much all I had for today. If you have any questions, please feel free to message me on Slack or to send me an email, and I'll get back to you on any questions you have about the lecture. And thank you again, everyone, and I will see you online. Hope you have a great week.